Good size, good amount of interest in space.
Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to NUPI's breakfast seminar on space diplomacy and transatlantic relations. My name is Nils Nagrud Schia. I'm a research professor here at NUPI, and I will be your moderator today. And this event is organized by, as a part of NUPI's research project Discover, Earth to Orbit, Building Bridges in Space Governance. And this project is financed by the Norwegian Research Council. And in this research project, we explore how diplomacy and international cooperation can help manage growing tensions in outer space. Outer space is no longer a distant abstract domain. It has become a critical arena for security, technological innovation, and international competition. Satellites underpin essential services we rely on every day, from navigation and communications to weather forecasting and financial systems. At the same time, major powers are investing heavily in space capabilities, both civilian and military, raising strategic tensions and the risk of conflicts. Europe, the United States, and China and emerging space actors are all shaping this environment, and the choices they make have direct implications for transatlantic relations, and also for Norway's interests and international governance frameworks. Discussions about strategic autonomy, cooperation, and rules of the road in space are no longer academic. They are fundamental to national security, economic stability, and global collaboration. In this seminar, we will explore these challenges through both a keynote presentation and a panel discussion. We will ask, how can diplomacy, technological development, and international institutions help reduce conflict risks while enabling cooperation? What are the strategic priorities for the EU, the US, and Norway? And how do China's ambitions affect the transatlantic relationship? And finally, how can emerging space actors, both state and commercial, be integrated responsibly into the governance of this domain? And today I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Mai'a K. She's a Dean's Professor of Political Science, International Affairs and Diplomacy at Northeastern University. Professor Cross has a wide-ranging research portfolio on diplomacy, public diplomacy, and space governance. Today, she will discuss how space diplomacy has so far enabled space to remain a peaceful domain, and how it can become a powerful tool to promote cooperation rather than conflict in the future. She also recently contributed to the Council on Foreign Relations Task Force on US Space Policy, whose report she might touch on later in the panel discussion. After her presentation, we will have a distinguished panel discussion with Marianne Riddervold, and she's a research professor here at NUPI and also at ARENA, Center for European Studies at the University of Oslo. She works on European foreign and security policy. And Claudia Emilia Aanonsen, who is a doctoral fellow here at NUPI, who works on cybersecurity, big tech, and strategic autonomy. Following the panel discussion, we will open for questions from the audience and online participations, probably not this time. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Mai'a K. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to NUPI for inviting me here today, and also to Marianne, Claudia, and Niels for joining the conversation in a little bit. So the question up for discussion today is whether space is increasingly characterized by militarized competition or whether we're witnessing the emergence of new areas of transatlantic cooperation based on space diplomacy. And related to this, are there emerging risks in the transatlantic space relationship? This is particularly in the context, of course, of the Trump administration and also Europe's new initiative, the EU together with the European Space Agency, in launching a new space strategy. So I'll argue today that when you look at the two perceptions of militarized competition versus space cooperation, that we are at a critical juncture, and actually both possibilities for the future are possible. But I'm going to actually emphasize, as Niels mentioned, something that is less acknowledged, which is the cooperative dimension. And I'll address three main points, then go to challenges for my three main points, and then policy prescription. So first, I'll more briefly cover these two competing perspectives to provide context. I'll then talk about the importance of space diplomacy, and then I'll zoom in on the transatlantic relationship. So the first the first major point I'd like to cover is, why are there these two competing perspectives, and what are they? So we frequently hear talk of space race 2.0, or this idea that we're in a new space race compared to the first one during the Cold War. And there's a lot of emphasis, especially in militaries around the world, about the potential for space wars, or space as the next battlefield. So Trump has declared space as a warfighting domain. And we see headlines about anti-satellite tests, Russia, China, India. The US Space Force actually promotes the slogan, always the predator, never the prey. So this is that conflict narrative that is actually quite common in the media. But there's another perspective that I think is actually more grounded in reality when you look at the actual activities of space actors. It's one where there are 90 countries now with space programs, and they're working together across a whole range of projects. There's NASA, which has engaged in over 4,000 cooperative projects since the 1960s. There's the International Space Station, which represents the largest civilian cooperation program in history. It includes, of course, since it was launched over 20 years ago, 15 nations continuously working together, astronauts from 27 countries, and literally over 100 countries benefiting from the scientific experiments that can take place on the ISS. So as Stephen Hawking put it in 2016, quote, "Space exploration has always been a great unifier. We seem able to cooperate between nations in space in a way that we can only envy on Earth." But of course, there is also this sort of assumption that space is on the way to getting weaponized, or possibly already weaponized. And I think it's crucial to recognize that despite the mounting tensions and the rhetoric that we hear, space actually remains non-weaponized. So it's long been militarized, and there's a difference there. Military technologies like satellite surveillance and communications have long operated in orbit, and we're very dependent on that. No nation, though, has yet actually deployed weapons systems in space. So even as Russia and China start to develop these capabilities, they certainly make threats about this. And we also have the reality that many of the civilian space assets in orbit have dual use potential. In other words, they could also be used for military purposes. But yet we have not actually formally crossed that line. And this distinction actually matters enormously. We don't want to talk as if we have already crossed the line if we haven't, because it would violate the Outer Space Treaty. It would shatter a powerful taboo that has kept space peaceful for over 6 decades. And the very fact that this line still holds, even as people talk about space race 2.0, really demonstrates, I think, space's resilience as a cooperative domain. And it really underscores the idea that if we cross the line, it would be consequential. So one of the reasons why I think that this has held, the reason why we have not gone into a realm of weaponization, is because of space diplomacy, which is my second main point that I want to touch on this morning. So space diplomacy is defined as both the formal and informal dialogue among actors who are involved in space. And this dialogue results in either more cooperation or more conflict. So it actually has results. And the dialogue can take place in a number of ways. It could be more about persuasion. It could be more about communication. It also might be grounded more in hard bargaining. But either way, the idea is to achieve compromise. And the dialogue actually takes place amongst a much wider range, an increasingly wider range of space diplomats or people who participate in space diplomacy. So of course we have formal professional diplomats who have space as their remit. But we also increasingly have scientists, astronauts, representatives of space agencies, commercial space representatives, groups of experts who cross borders, who share transnational knowledge. And all of that activity together, I think, can be divided into three major groups: science space diplomacy, economic, and military space diplomacy. So when you talk about science, this can include everything from medical breakthroughs, experiments on the ISS, collecting samples from Mars. There's a common technical language that really facilitates science space diplomacy. Then on the economic side, which is big, talking about commercial space, this is really an area that is just exploding in terms of size. It's reached over 650 billion, and it's projected by 2035 by McKinsey to reach 1.8 trillion. So it keeps growing and growing. And then in the military space diplomacy sector, this is where really that dual use nature of space assets, I think, really kicks in. It really requires diplomacy, even in this area that's adjacent to the potential for conflict, because you don't want to misperceive or miscommunicate what you're doing in space. So conducting diplomacy, I think, in and around space is very important, and it actually plays out somewhat differently than diplomacy on Earth. There is a distinction there, because I think we should remember that space has this capacity to inspire on a grand scale, especially when we think about the public and how they interact and perceive space. But it's also at the very limits of our technological and scientific capability, our capacity to sort of push forward the boundaries of technology. So it's precisely in the difficulty of establishing this human presence in space, this operation of how we interact and push the boundaries of space, that cooperation is not just beneficial, it's actually essential. So I'm going to now turn to the third point, which is kind of my biggest point and the purpose that we want to sort of examine here on the transatlantic relationship, now that that context is set. And I think the transatlantic relationship in space really exemplifies this tension that I've been talking about, the tension between the conflictual and the cooperative perspectives, these two very opposing perspectives, and to try to actually understand where the transatlantic relationship sits in that, but the challenges to that so far. So I want to discuss two brief examples that are cited often as evidence of transatlantic drift, where the relationship seems to be, or has in the past, seemed to be more conflictual. But the two examples actually demonstrate, again, the resilience of space cooperation. So the first one is the U.S. Space Force, established about 5 years ago. It, of course, sparked concern about militarization. But if we look at actual outcomes, I mean, for certain, establishing a new branch of the armed forces is a militarized act. But zooming out to space exploration overall and what that has meant for the relationship, the NASA administrator at the time, Jim Bridenstine, who is from the Republican Party, said at the International Astronautical Congress, "We can't do what we do without the support of our international partners. We want to do more than we've ever done before, and collaboration and cooperation is still the way to get it done." So this is happening simultaneously with the establishment of the U.S. Space Force. And then balancing that is Artemis, which is this program to return humans to the moon, and the goal is to then go on to Mars. This has entailed unprecedented cooperation, even though there have been some delays along the way. And as this diagram illustrates, ESA, the European Space Agency, is providing critical components. The Ariane 6 launch vehicle, the module for the Orion spacecraft, the lunar gateway, parts of the lunar gateway, habitation modules and the communication systems, lunar link, is attributed to ESA. So despite the Space Force, transatlantic relationship has remained strong. And another example is actually Galileo, which might be a little surprising to some, but when it was initially sort of conceived and launched, there were actually fears of strategic competition when Europeans sought independence from American GPS, which is part of the purpose of Galileo. So initially, American officials worried about signal interference and vulnerability through this competing system. But when we look at what happened as the plans for Galileo played out, non-state actors, so the scientists, the engineers, the space professionals on both sides of the Atlantic, they got together and they figured out how to technically get this done in a way that would work and preserve cooperation. So they were able to change minds about it and pursue the better arguments and have the transatlantic cooperation benefits really enhanced through the activity of achieving Galileo. And there's a whole slew now, if we look at today, of more recent developments in transatlantic space. Some of them occurring purely on the European side, some of them more on a cooperative level. But some of these initiatives might be familiar to you if you work in space policy. But just even earlier this year, the NATO defense ministers endorsed a commercial space strategy, which has been developed in close consultation with industry. So really this recognition that space is something we all rely on Earth, and security is no exception. But the commercial side is really where things are moving very quickly. So over 300 companies work together on this, and the NATO Space Operations Center, established last year, now coordinates allied space activities, excuse me, with the representatives of multiple nations working together. Oh, thank you very much. I was on an airplane all day yesterday, so a little bit dry. So these developments demonstrate, I'm a little worried it'll fall on equipment. So I think these developments really demonstrate that even as security concerns grow, and even as we look at NATO, a security alliance, that the transatlantic response, cooperation, coordination, bringing in multilateral efforts and engaging with commercial space is clear. And that brings me to just kind of looking more now at the European side, where we now have a unique institutional landscape, right? So we used to be able to, very recently, just speak about the European Space Agency, ESA, as the only major space actor, primary vehicle for European space activities. And that has been pretty straightforward, because ESA, founded in 1975 after merging its two precursors, had an explicit commitment to, quote, pursue and strengthen European cooperation for exclusively peaceful purposes in space research and technology. And this really resonated actually with the very origins of the spaceflight movement going back to the 1920s that sparked and inspired the discovery of rocketry and space exploration to begin with. All of this has been ESA's guiding principle, and it really paralleled what NASA was doing. It's really a tremendous example of space cooperation with 22 countries, the success of working together with others on Space Lab, the Ariane launcher series, participating in the ISS, and so on. So there are over 231,000 Europeans who work in the space sector today. But starting in the early 2000s, of course, as the EU itself developed its and sort of executed its common foreign and security policy, the need to kind of increasingly focus on space security as opposed to space as more of a scientific and technological realm became more pressing. So then in 2021, as you know, the EU decided to launch its European Union Agency for the Space Program, or as the acronym, we could call it USPA. So this has an unprecedented budget. It's fairly new, but it has this budget of nearly 15 billion euros for the period from 2021 to 2027. It represents the highest amount ever committed by Brussels for space programs. So you see this shifting emphasis on space, but USPA being separate from ESA allows it to take on more of the strategic and security element than ESA originally was intended. So now there's this kind of division of labor, making it quite unique, right, with a kind of quasi-federal system like the EU having USPA alongside this long-standing sort of NASA-ish organization called ESA. But the division of labor is very clearly delineated. And so you have USPA managing operations for Galileo, Copernicus, and the GovSatcom secure communication system. This last one really, it coordinates over 400 satellites to prevent collisions in space. And then most significantly, I would say, is this new European Commission contract for IRIS-2. So IRIS stands for Infrastructure for Resilience, Interconnectivity, and Security by Satellite. So if you think about, common household names of Galileo and Copernicus, IRIS is the next one. It's the third flagship program, and it's a public-private partnership, which means it is very significant. The EU Commissioner, Andrius Kubilius, he stated as they were signing off on IRIS-2, quote, "We are under threat, our communications are under threat," and he's really referring to Russian jamming and cable cutting. "We cannot afford to be too dependent on countries or companies from outside the EU." So again, it's this realization that moving into a new space agency like USPA, in addition to ESA, that there has to be this security dimension and this autonomy, the ability for the EU to have its separate security side. Along with this, I would just highlight vision for the European space economy, which explicitly states that the EU should become a global space leader by 2050. Just as a kind of comparison, China has stated that it wants to be kind of the premier space actor by 2040. So there's a little bit of a difference in that kind of vision. But I think there are huge advantages, of course, to what the EU is doing together with the US in the transatlantic relationship. So this is really this vision is really the first comprehensive strategy that really acknowledges that space is no longer this technological field. It is a complete economic ecosystem. And it looks ahead to what commercial space is really interested in, which is off-world stuff, space mining, being able to take advantage commercially of space resources off of Earth. And this vision, which is so comprehensive, it has over 40 actions. It includes the EU Space Act, which is a proposed act that would actually harmonize all of the different legislation systems in place in the EU. So there are about 13 of those. It's a bit fragmented. And the aim is to create a single market for space activities. So this new system is unique, and I think it is actually advantageous for the transatlantic relationship. So if we zoom out, what does this actually mean for the transatlantic relationship? And I think that it has a lot of potential because ESA is able to continue its deep partnerships with NASA on a whole range of things, from the James Webb Space Telescope to the Artemis Lunar Gateway. But meanwhile, USPA can develop European capabilities that enhance rather than undermine the transatlantic relationship, just like the two examples I discussed earlier. The IRIS system, which really is, as I described, very much about the strategic use of space, is actually interoperable. So that means that it is not designed to be kind of closed off and undermine connections transatlantically. So just to kind of contrast the earlier quote, another European Commission official said, "Space is for everyone, so we need to work together to address challenges in a collaborative, cooperative way. In Europe, we cherish the underlying cooperative culture." So after laying all of this out, and I realize that I'm leaning more towards there's so much potential here, let me talk about challenges for a few moments. As Niels mentioned, I recently served on the Council on Foreign Relations Task Force on U.S. Space Policy, And I will say, my perspective and the rest of the task force, so there's a spectrum there, and there were military defense officials as well as NASA officials. And I'm definitely more on the cooperative side, so I tended to drag the task force report. There were a few copies outside a moment ago, to drag it a little bit more towards space diplomacy and cooperation. But here are the challenges. So, and this is discussed in that report, the replacement of the ISS. So the ISS is slated to be decommissioned. And as I said, it's the biggest civilian cooperation initiative that we have. So if it's replaced with several private space companies, the question is, how do we maintain that as a symbol and as an actual platform for space cooperation? Perhaps Artemis, but it really is not quite the same. It does allow another cooperative initiative, but having a bunch of private space companies is categorically different. The Wolf Amendment, and this is really on the US side and gets into our discussion later that might bring China into the mix. But this is the Wolf Amendment is in the United States. It's this limitation, which has actually been interpreted as a prohibition on NASA-China cooperation. It's basically led to, because American scientists and astronauts cannot cooperate with their Chinese counterparts, it has led to a global system that contains two parallel systems. And there is concern that this could harden into sort of alliance blocks, with the U.S. leading one, and ESA certainly in that category with the U.S., and China and Russia leading another one. So China has its own orbiting space station with astronauts in it. It also has plans to build an international lunar research station, which has attracted 13 countries and 40 institutional partners. On the Artemis side, led by the Artemis Accords, which Norway recently signed on to, led by the United States, you have 56 countries, and only a couple of them have signed on to both. So that's certainly a challenge, is the risk remains real that you end up with two blocks. Third, existing space treaties are not really fully equipped to grapple with the new developments that have occurred, especially when it comes to commercial space. So thinking about resource extraction, which can result in just enormous profits from space mining. Thinking about kind of how do you create safety zones on the moon, for example, where other actors don't interfere in the zone that you've set so you can do science or commercial activities. The treaties, the Artemis Accords provide kind of a starting point, but they actually have to be hashed out in detail. Specific rules of the road need to be determined so that actors in space know what they can do. So that is another challenge. The fourth is counter space capabilities are growing. So direct ascent systems going from Earth to space that could potentially target satellites, orbital technologies, the development of electronic warfare, directed energy weapons, cyber threats. None of these things are actually destructive at the moment, but the development of them is growing, and the threat of potentially weaponizing space is growing. So this is a huge challenge, how to hold that line and not cross the line and violate the Outer Space Treaty going forward. So to be sure, competition in space is usually very helpful. You could think of everything from, Sputnik and what that sparked, all the way to reusable rockets. We need competition. It provides innovation. But we don't want competition to harden into these adversarial blocks. And this is where the transatlantic relationship, I think, is very important in thinking about how to deal with governance challenges, with regulations and standards that are necessary. So policy recommendations, I could probably go on and on about these, but just to name a few things that I think are important. The first is to avoid creating self-fulfilling prophecy. So the rhetoric about space actually matters. Those quotes I gave you earlier about always the predator, never the prey, space race 2.0, space as the next battlefield. If we employ battlefield rhetoric all the time when talking about space, and there are many sectors in the policy world that do this, then we can actually construct a reality that is not really occurring at the moment. That is not, space is not a battlefield at the moment. So the conflictual rhetoric is actually quite harmful. And instead, really talking about the unprecedented levels of international cooperation that we stand to lose if we go towards battlefield rhetoric is the first recommendation. Secondly, and this is in the Council on Foreign Relations report, expanding diplomatic engagement, particularly with China, is crucial. So again, thinking about those two competing blocks that are kind of emerging, but that we also want to diffuse. One way to do that is to think about ways in which we and you know, in this sense, the U.S., Europe, and so forth, can build bridges. There is a real threat from China, so I'm not suggesting exchanging technologies or giving sort of access to critical areas of space equipment that could actually be dual use. But instead what I'm suggesting is engagement that could be something like on the US side, thinking about what is the real meaning of the Wolf Amendment. It does not have to be interpreted beyond what it actually states, which is simply to say that US-China cooperation can occur as long as it receives approval first. At the federal level in the United States. So if actors in space actually behaved according to what it stipulates, then you could open up areas of cooperation at the scientific level. Other things could be discussions about astronaut rescue, right? That doesn't involve exchange of technology, and it actually is something that is in line with the Outer Space Treaty and subsequent efforts at treaties, really to think about the good of humanity, science, the need to rescue each other in danger, which exists in naval regulations as well. And then even something as simple as a hotline. So there's so much in space right now with space debris and growing numbers of satellite constellations. We on Earth are constantly monitoring whether something is about to crash into something else and whether we can avoid that. If there's an actual hotline with China that enables direct communication and coordination over this, that would go a long way in helping to create bridges that can serve as a fulcrum to greater understanding and avoiding these kinds of alliance blocks. Fourth, strengthening the rules-based international order for space, and this kind of addresses that challenge I mentioned earlier about the ambiguity about the rules of the road. Safety zones, resource extraction, standards for private companies, responsible behavior in space. It's clear that the US is retrenching from its role in trying to think about these governance standards. And this is where I think Europe could really help as part of the transatlantic relationship, showing that commitment to multilateralism and being at the forefront of these discussions, really pushing those discussions forward. Because it's not enough just to sign the Artemis Accords. You then need to have these breakout groups to really talk about what it means in practice. And I think Europe actually could lead there. And related to that, fifth, leveraging this unique EU-ESA architecture. It is kind of part of this academic notion of differentiated integration. So in some ways you could think of it as a weakness. In other ways you could think of it really as a strength. That it is possible to use this infrastructure to have more flexibility, something that's more flexible than a single merged institution might offer. And so thinking through that, how best to leverage it, because USPA, the EU Space Agency, is incredibly new. It's very, very new, and so there's a lot of wiggle room there. And then finally, I think the public dimension is absolutely crucial as all of this moves forward in a far more complex landscape. Because as we all know, we're all dependent on space every day of our lives. So investing in public diplomacy about space is key. Going back to that point about inspiration, right? It's been well documented that when astronauts go into space, they experience this so-called overview effect. It's this profound shift in perspective, seeing Earth from space. And that has real diplomatic power. So I think being able to engage in education, public engagement, cultural diplomacy, and so forth is key. And I just would conclude with this, just kind of summing up what I started with, and I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion as well, that we have this question: is space headed on a trajectory of being more militarized, possibly even crossing the line into weaponization? Or are we witnessing a new realm, a new potential for transatlantic cooperation? And to be sure, we're at a critical juncture. So even though, as I've said, the cooperative landscape remains remarkably strong, usually in spite of some governments, it remains day to day really much more cooperative than conflictual. We are creeping closer to the more negative trajectory. And so I think the choices that we make now will really matter in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mai'a. I would now welcome the other panelists to take the floor. Together with you, Mai'a.
Should I sit here?
Yeah. Let's sit. There's 4 chairs. Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting talk, where you elaborate on how space is an area for collaboration and cooperation. And this is a very interesting topic about space, I think, because there's a couple of things in the world right now which is new. In a way, we're into a new space race. There's a lot of new actors in space. There's a lot of new tensions in the world. So there's a lot of challenges to collaboration, and things are moving very, very fast compared to what they have been doing the last decades in space. So a couple of years ago there was like 4,000 satellites in near orbit around the world, and now there's 12,000, and this is speeding up also in the years ahead of us. So you touched upon this, but could you elaborate a little bit about how you see this moving on in the next coming years? Is the climate on Earth affecting the climate on cooperation in space, or is the aspect that you ended with, the new perspective when you're out in space, so strong that it can really stay there as a collaborating area for international cooperation? And you have this, where you have this really, we're moving into a new world order almost, where there's big power politics on Earth. So yeah.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really great question. It's so fast-paced, as you mentioned, that it's in some ways difficult to keep anticipating because the geopolitics on Earth changes so rapidly. I do think about, though, when Russia invaded Ukraine, which was a significant moment for geopolitics. One of the questions from the space community, of course, was, well, what happens with the International Space Station? And some Russian representatives of Roscosmos, including the director, threatened crazy things like breaking up the ISS in mid-orbit or leaving astronauts there. And ultimately, that didn't come to pass, and the ISS continued its operation. So I think there is something that insulates about space, even though there's this kind of military tie. Because, as I said, so much of the operations in space is economic and scientific and technological, it is somewhat insulated. There is no way to continue in space if countries are not working together. So I think there will be more tensions, particularly because the ISS is going to be decommissioned, but there's still a few more years left of that. So it's possible that it'll last just long enough that we might move out of this more geopolitical moment. But it's hard to predict. I do think that the nature of the structure of cooperation that we're seeing in space is changing. So I don't think it's going to look the same, especially because more and more actors are involved in space, particularly commercial actors. Today and in the past, it has mainly looked like first the Apollo era, going to the moon, and then it has looked like essentially the ISS and these cooperative kind of efforts at probes to Mars and so forth. But now I think we're likely to see more of a human presence in space, longer-term human space travel, and in these locations further from Earth, like the Moon and Mars, cooperation will be even more important. And I think it will entail now more complexity because of the commercial sector. So one of the reports that I also put outside is at the intersection of human space exploration and biotech. Boston, where I live, is actually a huge hub of biotech. And this is a way in which I think, as the commercial space sector develops, we will see more of that effort to preserve cooperation for commercial purposes as well. So I think it's a mixed bag. It's hard to just say it's one or the other. But I do think that cooperation will continue despite the tensions on Earth, and some of that will be due to the commercial side of things.
Mm. And what about the governance side of things? Because in the world right now, you see the world is going. So you see there's a lot of pressure on multilateralism.
Yeah.
It's been for a couple of years, and it continues. And in Discover, the research project that I mentioned in the beginning, we're exploring various degrees of governance, global governance, in space activities. So we're from frequencies, which is very, very good governed in a way, and to mining on, for instance, the Moon, which is not that much governed in global governance. So how do you see, and global governance on space is happening on Earth, not by astronauts, but politicians, international diplomats, and how do you see that cooperation being affected by big power politics or by space perspectives?
Yeah. So I guess what I was referring to before was kind of, in some ways, like these one-off cooperative projects in more contained areas. But when we talk about governance, it's much broader, and it's also about formal kind of agreements. So I do think that the Artemis Accords is kind of that make or break kind of initiative. Because up until the Artemis Accords were sort of put forward and countries were invited to sign on to them, there had not been a major breakthrough in space governance at all, despite needs for managing space debris and space traffic and all sorts of other very pressing needs. The Artemis Accords was finally that breakthrough. It wasn't ideal. It isn't ideal because it's led by the United States. It's better to have true multilateral governance. The Artemis Accords try to make it that, but it's still led by the United States. So I think if the Trump administration steps back and gives up on the Artemis Accords, we're in real danger when it comes to governance, because those accords really encompass so many different areas potentially, and they just set the platform for all these different actors around the world to then get together and formalize things. So I think that would be a huge blow. But if the Artemis Accords remain at least enough for other actors to step forward, like Europe, then I think there is hope to find methods forward. I do caution against kind of perspectives that are purely legalistic. So when you think about just kind of UN space law, that is just such a high bar and almost impossible to achieve, which is why we need to really value the Outer Space Treaty, that I think always kind of obsessing about kind of trying to sign law into place can be counterproductive. I think that if you aim for that, it often won't work. It simply has had a miserable track record. So the idea of actually having kind of initiatives that create diplomatic forums for people to continually work on space as it evolves is probably more important. The emphasis on space diplomacy is for this reason, that being able to kind of formally set up fora for space diplomacy to continually take place, I think has more progress than formal space law.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll soon move over to Marianne and Claudia, but I wanted you to elaborate a little bit about, because you said that on your report, handed over to the Trump administration. You also it includes a little bit on China.
Yeah, yeah.
Could you just elaborate a little bit about China's plans and ambitions and the content in that report on China and space?
Sure, yeah. So in that report, which is really intended to lay out the future of U.S. space policy and encourage the administration, the presidential administration, to adopt these kinds of policies, there was a heavy emphasis on China. And that is because, of course, China is just growing in space terms. It has very ambitious plans, and it's doing this across many levels in technological competition, including AI and biotech and quantum and others. So space is no exception. And I think the sense was that space is, because of its growing military sort of importance, that China will increasingly become a threat and potentially cross that line into weaponizing space if the United States is not very careful and doesn't sharpen its policy towards China. So the recommendation was that it is important to be very clear about what countries are able to do and not able to do according to the Outer Space Treaty. One of the more forward-looking recommendations in the report, in order to deal with China, was to actually declare space as a formal global commons, because it is not formally declared as such. And then some of the other initiatives I mentioned in my talk about diplomatic engagement with China, so creating a hotline, a system of communication, being just very, very closed off with a wall between China and others is a dangerous situation to be in. So if China is going to have this kind of two-part goal of both becoming, the biggest space actor by 2040 and pushing the boundaries of space security, then diffusing that both with direct engagement and with really emphasizing space diplomacy and the cooperative realm is important. And I will say, there are definitely people in the military defense side of the United States who would like that sharpened even further. So they tend to think about deterrence in space and building up very quickly, which the Trump administration is trying to do, actual space-based weapons or missiles that would shoot down other incoming missiles. So actually the U.S. itself, under the Trump administration, playing around with that line itself on whether you cross the line into space weaponization. So there are some who would really lean towards going all the way in terms of deterrence and military use of space, and others, which I think is more reflected in the report at the end of the day after our debates on it, that would really emphasize the global commons, the cooperative element, engaging with China and so on.
Thank you, Mai'a. Moving over to Marianne now. So if you have anything you wanted to follow up on Maia's talk, you're welcome to do that. Otherwise, I have a question for you on moving over to the EU. Mm-hmm. And how do you see EU's role in space diplomacy and international cooperation in space? If you could just talk a little bit about how you see both EU governance and also the security perspective on that.
Okay, yes. As Mai'a also mentioned, the EU is quite a big actor in space. We tend not to discuss that much in Norway, but it's actually the biggest actor in space after the United States for now, even if China is very ambitious in this domain. What we see, I guess, is that the EU space policies have been very civilian or oriented towards civilian aims. So you have the navigation systems or the Copernicus system, which is linked to kind of environmental surveillance, weather forecasts, flood warnings, all of that we also depend on in Norway. But what we have seen in recent years, and specifically after the Ukraine war, and also with the Trump administration, is that space has become very central to the EU's aim of achieving strategic autonomy. So we see a clear securitization of EU space policies. one very concrete example that kind of helped push that was when the Trump administration withheld satellite-based surveillance and intelligence from Ukraine in March this year, which like directly affected what was happening on the ground. So because as it's today, the EU is completely dependent on U.S. Capacities in space for these kind of security and defense purposes. So now I'm not in outer space, now I'm more in the near Earth kind of space capacities. So there's really a lot going on in the EU to kind of strengthen the EU space program, which follows the EU's multi-annual 7-year budgets. So there's going to be a new space program now, and as Mai'a already mentioned, this IRIS² component is the newest aspect of that. It's already been established, it's being rolled out, but there are also these other kind of dual-use systems now that are being discussed, like Space Shield or the drone wall that we've been talking about lately, which will also be based on satellite-based capacities. It's developing an independent European air defense, will depend on independent kind of resources, so there's a lot going on, and it's very much focused on also independence from the US. Mm-hmm. So there is cooperation still, but there's also much more focus on this independent from the United States as well. But I guess it's two sides of this. It's the kind of security and defense, and this kind of space being core to strategic autonomy, core to developing independent resources and capabilities. But it's also the other side of EU space policies are also linked to space governance. And Mai'a already mentioned the Space Act, which is a new regulation in the EU that is creating a common market for the space economy, which is a way of kind of power grab by the EU. Basically, it's space has not been a supranational policy area in the EU, and now when it becomes part of the common market, it's going to be supranational, and the Commission gets a much bigger say, and also the agency. So it will also be relevant to Norway that we will also be bound by this. But what we see in this Space Act is a very clear focus on kind of applying this Brussels effect that we sometimes hear about, where the EU, the most famous example is the GDPR, the privacy regulation. So what the EU does, it regulates companies that operate on European soil in the common market. And in effect, it kind of regulates also globally, because if you have privacy rules for technological firms operating in Europe, which that includes Google, Microsoft, Facebook, etc., they tend to develop the same products still for the European market and for the global market. Mm-hmm. So in the consequence is that Microsoft products that are rolled out in the United States also follows the GDPR regulations. So that's a very clear, it's a strategy, it's aimed at global regulation, and we see that also now with Space Act in space. For example, just to take one example, it introduces rules for space debris, like space garbage. So any company operating on European soil will also have to follow these rules on space debris, which means that if Starlinks operate in Europe, it also has to follow these regulations once they are adopted. So that's another aspect of that. And the EU is also, we know that multilateral cooperation is more difficult, but the EU has always been very focused on multilateral cooperation. It's in its DNA. It's kind of struggling now to become more of a geopolitical actor. But it's also very active on the international scene, which is also it does a lot of informal things to try to coordinate countries. Establishing these informal forums, for example, or financing secretariats or non-governmental organizations, etc. So, and Norway, of course, cooperates closely with the EU. So I think it's these kind of, it used to be a very civilian-oriented policy area. Now it's securitized to a large extent. There's actually nothing left in the EU space programs now that are not going to be linked to security in some sense, because they're going to use Galileo, Copernicus, the civilian kind of tools and capacities also for dual use purposes. And we, even if we don't think about it all the time, we actually, everything we do depends on well-functioning space capacities. I mean, we don't have weather forecasts, flood predictions, crisis management, navigation, financial transactions, trade, everything depends on working. And so, and all of these capacities are now also more incorporated with kind of security and defense purpose tools. So that's the one side, and the other one is the governance aspect.
Thanks, Marianne. And you mentioned Norway very briefly in all of this, and you, together with a couple of other colleagues here at NUPI, are working on a report on what all this means for Norway and Norway's room for maneuver in space diplomacy, space activities, things like that. Could you just elaborate a little bit, tell us a little bit about what you have found there, or what this means, what EU's role on space means for Norway? Is it just a EU-Norway thing, or is it something specific to that area?
Yeah, we're looking into that, and we are also doing a project for the Ministry of Defense, which also includes EU space policies and transatlantic relations in space, which is, this seminar is actually also linked to. And Norway is linked to, we're part of the EU space program today. For now, we don't have an agreement with the EU on joining the next space program. So, and the one we're part of now, which gives us access to all of these space-based researches or near-Earth resources, is kind of running out in 2027. And we don't have independent, well, in security and defense, we of course have a lot of cooperation with the United States and other European countries, because as of now, the EU doesn't have that much satellite capacity in the area of security and defense, even if that is being developed. But on the civilian side, we depend on being part of the EU space program, and also of a new agreement. And it has proved really, really challenging for Norway to get access to this. And that is, it's a bit technical, but the thing is that Norway has the EEA agreement when it comes to the common market, and we also have the possibility of participating in different kinds of programs, like the Horizon Research Program and the Space Program. Mm-hmm. But now that the EU Space Program is becoming much more dual use and also linked to the EU's foreign and security policy, security and defense policy, we can't really just use the EEA agreement to get an agreement. And it has proved really, really difficult for Norway to secure these types of agreements, and we're still struggling to get that now with the EU. So in our report, we find that Norway is, as any other modern society, extremely dependent on space capacities, much more than we even more than I knew before starting doing the report. We are very dependent on the EU's capacities, because there's really no alternative, because the other European countries focus on the EU. There's no way they're going to do something on the side of the EU, so to speak. They have this program. But we are struggling to get in. When it comes to governance, it's very similar to everything else that the EU, to EU-Norway relations. Norway tends to follow the EU in absolutely everything the EU does on the multilateral arena, which has to do also with, of course, shared interests and views on multilateral cooperation. The only exemption is when we're engaged in peace negotiations. That's when we kind of do not follow the EU. So we also we try to coordinate as much as possible with the EU, also when it comes to space governance in the UN, for example. But as with other cases, it's more like the EU coordinates, and we kind of we follow whatever the EU decides. Yeah.
Tag along.
Yeah, we tag along.
All right. Building on that, Claudia, on Marianne's points, you've done a lot of research on strategic autonomy, and what do you think how does this affect strategic autonomy for Norway and the EU, the technological development, the space race, and for transatlantic relations?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think making a case for the importance of focusing also kind of analytically on technological development is important. Also, since we're having a discussion about diplomacy and cooperation, we also of course, there is a discursive aspect, and policy development relies a lot on how we talk about things, but technological development essentially sets the conditions of possibility for actually making policy or doing something in space. So I think, as we all know, critical theorists have been asking this question for decades about how we imagine things, how we talk about things, and how these come to affect the ambitions that we set for example, strategic autonomy in the EU. But essentially what we think about, they bring attention to questions that go beyond what we see and what is, and perhaps problematize the more the ideas and how we develop an idea of what ought to be in space and how we imagine this. And what ought to be in space and our ambitions for example, strategic autonomy and space exploration or exploitation is a normative question. So despite the global commons and a commitment to institutional arrangements, it's important to kind of problematize who makes these decisions and who plays into these negotiations about what we should be doing in space. So the EU, relating to what Mariana was talking about, the EU has, especially in the past years, been witnessing a transition from what has been described as exploring space to exploiting space as something of a resource for military or operational purposes. So this has taken place vis-a-vis with the discourse on strategic autonomy developing, and Europe also heavily investing in technological development, also with commercial actors. So as you've also been mentioning, Galileo is a perfect example of this actually happening, where once it was developed, it was declared as a purely civilian program. But it was designed, it was engineered as a dual-use technology. So this is to make an argument for what technological development and design and engineering actually does and how it conditions our possibilities. But since Galileo was developed as a dual-use system, it could later be declared as a dual-use system, as also for military purposes. And another good example, I think, of technological development is Europe's Ariane rocket program, which has actually been operational since 1979, but without launcher capabilities, Europe hasn't been able to launch their own rockets until quite recently. So it's a perfect example of how Europe is highly dependent on the US also for their own rocket program, or US commercial actors. And as all societies on Earth increases their dependence on space, data from space and space technologies, that for the EU, as an example, also increases Europe's dependence on foreign actors such as the US for example, launcher capabilities. And a third example, I think, and Mariana was mentioning Starlink and looking to Ukraine and what's been happening there. But another example that was kind of a wake-up call for Europe in terms of their own space technology capabilities was when Starlink offered satellite communication capabilities to Ukraine once their own systems weren't functioning anymore. But under the constant threat from the private, SpaceX, which we all know, was threatening to take away the actual communication infrastructure as well as deny access in Crimea. So this is a private operator with political ambitions. So this did actually function as a wake-up. It has been described in the EU as a wake-up call in terms of problems with foreign ownership over critical technologies such as communication, in which IRIS-2, which has also been mentioned today, offers a critical communication infrastructure that in a sense could substitute or at least complement, but ideally substitute privately owned technologies, satellites like Starlink.
Thanks, Claudia. Would any of you like to follow up on this?
I guess I would just pick up on the moving from exploration to exploitation point. I think we all have a tendency to focus on what's changing, right? So if you look at what's changing, it does seem like things are very much securitizing. But I actually just finished a book manuscript on the EU's grand strategy looking at all of ESA's plans and investments in place for space that go 50 years into the future and beyond. And it's astounding, right? The exploration piece is still very much there, and it's still growing exponentially. And we're talking about things about looking at the origins of the universe, understanding dark matter, understanding the nature of life, and, So, I mean, I think there's no giving up on the exploration part, even as we start to kind of encompass other areas, like Claudia mentioned.
And of course, there's a difference between ESA and the EU.
Exactly.
Because the ESA is an intergovernmental organization in Europe that focuses on that.
Yeah.
And that is purely, and then the EU is becoming more of a geopolitical actor who also uses. But it doesn't mean, like Mai'a says, that it's the EU is giving up on governance, right?
Yeah.
So we have to think of these as two different things. Because we all depend on space, and the unique thing with space is that it's non-territorializable in a sense, right? We can't divide it between us. And it's becoming, we tend to say that it's becoming contested, conflictual, and congested, right? Because there are so many satellites. Now I'm in low Earth orbit, not outer space. And so there is no alternative to cooperation in space. So there's also kind of this self-interested drive towards cooperation in space, at least in airspace. Then you have all the different challenging link to space exploration and resource extraction, for example, which is going to be, this is maybe where the geopolitics might play out more. So and you mentioned China, Mai'a, but if I may also ask Mai'a a question. Do you see, and you've been studying this for a long time, do you see China showing an interest in space both? Well, I think there are when it comes to, for example, satellite constellations or space debris, but when it comes to outer space exploration and resource extraction, do you see China being interested in cooperation? Is there much cooperation between the US and China in this domain? And also about then the Trump administration, are they really very keen on cooperating with China?
Yeah, I mean, I think with China, because of the Wolf Amendment that I mentioned earlier, there are very isolated, sort of contained instances, small instances of cooperation with the US and China. But as far as China's interest in cooperation, actually it has shown quite a strong interest. It's interesting because as we talk about kind of like the decline of the rules-based international order, decline of cooperation and so forth, actually the major powers in the international system on Earth still talk about cooperation. And so it may not be the form of cooperation that typically is kind of reassuring, because some of it is Russia-China cooperation. So we can't really know what's going on behind the scenes. But in terms of, for example, the Chinese space station in orbit, Tiangong, it is actually open to international partners to cooperate in terms of scientific experiments and so forth. The international ILRS, the International Lunar Research Station, on the other hand, actually looks a little more strategic. It's a little more closed off, although there are these other partners that have signed on, so it is cooperative. It is not as open, so it would be kind of like a permanent moon base. It's not as open. But further afield, if you look at all these kind of various configurations of partners and smaller groups cooperating on space, you see almost every type of configuration you can imagine of countries from the global south with Europe or China, Latin America. I mean, there's so many configurations of cooperation because, again, as you mentioned as well, it's essential to cooperate in such difficult technological realms. The U.S., I think it is concerning, especially when the Trump administration launched and Elon Musk was so much at the forefront of everything. there was this mention of Elon Musk saying he'll just go take his his Starship and go to Mars, which is actually not what we want to see, right? It's a commercial actor. It's unilateral without cooperation. Who knows what kind of contamination to the Martian environment would result from that? It's just an irresponsible type of act. And so that kind of thing, thankfully, has receded. But that's not how, anyone in the space community would want to see exploration take place.
Yeah, thanks. I think we'll open up the floor for the audience to ask questions. So if you have a question, just please raise your hand. We have a couple of questions here. Katrina Glad, you were first, and then we have two over there.
Thank you very much for this talk, Katarina Glab from the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. I would like to ask you about the terms of cooperation in space and inequality. So some historians of space law would argue that the Outer Space Treaty has been made possible by excluding the third world countries. And some would also say that this kind of inequality or power dominance is also visible in the Artemis Accords now. So what can governance initiatives like this do in order to serve what space as a mostly publicly funded activity is made for, to contribute to security but also peace on Earth, and that in a sustainable way? So in which way, what can be done in order to not repeat these kind of inequalities that are in the system?
And you would like to answer that?
I can.
You can start. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the question. It is great. And I think the signing of the Outer Space Treaty in the 60s, that is the world, back then. So a lot of the agreements that were put into place back then reflect the power balances as well. But we have many signatories. It's almost universal, the signatories on the Outer Space Treaty, which is good. When I've been in forums of space diplomacy where actual space diplomats are, sitting around the table, as I mentioned, because 90 countries have space programs, you see a lot of representation from people from the global south, thankfully. But you're right that when they do start talking about the US, or they happen to find out that I'm American, suddenly it's like, what is it with this Artemis Accords, right? It seems designed just to basically be kind of top-down U.S. Control over all of this. And I have responded, as I will now, that the Artemis Accords, the structure of it is not ideal, because you don't want to have something that looks like it's coming from one country diffusing outward to everybody else. In an ideal world, it would be truly multilateral. I have spoken to some of the originators of the Artemis Accords, and they said the process to actually conceive of the first launch of it did involve many other countries, including from the global south. So it may look more unilateral than it is, but nonetheless, it certainly is US-led. And I think that in that sense, the players involved, as they play out what needs to happen, which is the actual sort of legalization and sort of codification of the Artemis Accords, have to be very careful to be inclusive. We have to recognize that the US and NASA, of course, are the biggest space players, so it's not a surprise that it played out this way. But now there's an opportunity to involve others. And I think that's where, again, space diplomacy as the means, as the mechanism, is really actually very, very important, more so than formal laws registered at the United Nations. Because when you have space diplomacy, you bring people to the table. And you have all of these space actors around the world who are really actively engaged in space programs. And so I think keeping these big cooperative plans like Artemis open to everybody to sign onto the moon, hopefully Gateway, which will be a multinational, orbiting space station around the moon, will also continue to be open to everybody. But I definitely don't think rewriting the one great treaty we have, the Outer Space Treaty, makes sense at this point. So the idea would be to keep it as an ongoing process that is discursive, that is diplomacy, is, in my view, kind of the best way to ensure that those countries that are smaller are also at the table and fully involved.
I think you should take more.
Yep. we have one question there, one there. So we'll take you two and you, and then we'll let you answer those. Okay.
Thank you so much for an excellent presentation. I'm Henrik Syse from PRIO and recently become a space historian. I'll make one comment and one question. The comment is, I think there's quite a lot to learn from history as well. The book I've just co-written on the history of the Apollo program leads up to what happened 50 years ago with Apollo-Soyuz. And it's a really interesting development in space diplomacy, because when they signed the Outer Space Treaty in '67, no one would have thought that we'll actually do something together. But after they actually landed on the moon, people on both sides has this idea, maybe we can carve this out as sort of space for collaboration. Of course, it succeeded admirably, and I think there's something beautiful about the fact that coincidentally this happened more or less at the exact same time as the Helsinki Accords were signed. It was this movement to see space as something that can inspire us. And I think it's great the way in which you also emphasize that aspect of it. You know, the exploration, the overview effect. You know, Stu Russo on Apollo 14 said in the UN, if you had been where I've been, the discussions in this room would have been different. And I think, you know, there's a certain beauty to that, but of course the story is also true. My question is about India, because India signed on to the Artemis Accords, but very much wants to have a strong relationship with China as well in space. Do you think India could play a mediating role in space diplomacy, given its interests and, of course, its huge technological capabilities? The Chandrayaan missions have been real successes. So could India play a role? Thanks again.
We'll collect a few more. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. My name is Richard Olsen. I'm with the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment. A couple of comments / questions. I guess Marianne mentioned that the EU space program will expire soon, the current one. And to me, it's important that Norway thinks very closely about whether or not to participate in the next one, exactly for the reason that the next one will be much more security focused. And if you look at the history, Norway has not had access to the security aspects of functions in the existing EU space program. So the other part of that comment is I'm surprised that you're talking so much about the EU and ESA without bringing in the national space programs in Europe. Because if you look at, for example, Germany's space program far exceeds the European Union space program as we speak. It's a much larger, the DLR is a much larger space agency than any of the others in Europe. And to me, it's we're, as I say, at a point where we need to assess whether we are going to continue to cooperate in the European space program as increasing costs, or whether we should strengthen our ties to the individual European nations for a more strategic collaboration. So I don't know if you have any comments there.
So I think we'll let the panelists answer those two questions, and then we'll take you to after that. Okay? So please.
I start?
Yeah. You
Yes. Thank you, Henrik, for the question. I actually, when I started working on space, the first few years were all in the archives. So I really appreciate your perspective and emphasizing history, because there is a lot to learn. And in particular, during the Cold War, when I entered, I first went to the JFK archives for obvious reasons. And when I first entered, I just wanted the folders on Russia. And it turned out that the folders were all on international cooperation with Russia and space. And ever since then, I spent years looking at the NASA archives, the Boeing archives, the EU's ESA archives, and everything is about international cooperation. So that is what history tells us, even when most of us just look back and think, oh, space race, right? It's really a misnomer. So I do think your suggestion about India is a really good one, and that plays in so much to this idea of diffusing the formation of two alliance blocks. I think there are two countries, Thailand and Senegal, who have signed on to both Artemis and the Chinese program ILRS. And we need more in order to avoid this. So India is a great example. If it's already in Artemis, you know, actually encouraging it, sort of celebrating it, also being very closely cooperating with China could be helpful. And I'm not this kind of easy on China when it comes to cooperation on Earth, but I do think that space is a bit of a different realm. especially when it comes to science and technology. So I think India is emerging as a very significant space actor. And so having more of that weight that involves kind of bridging is an important role to play. Maybe I could say something about Germany, but I think I should turn it over to my colleagues to answer the second question. If you want, I could always chime in, but yeah.
Yeah, we have been looking into this exact question for some time now. And I think there are different aspects to this. One is that, no, we can't do without the EU space program when it comes to civilian capacities. There's not really an alternative to that. Because all the European countries are cooperating in the EU, so they are not kind of developing duplicating systems. So there is no, I mean, we could imagine Norway developing all of these capacities itself. The UK left the EU and the EU space program. It evaluated its ability to develop an independent space program for civilian purposes. It found that it couldn't. So, and then came back into Copernicus, now trying to get an agreement on more. It might be difficult to imagine Norway being able to do that when the UK is not. I mean, I guess the only country in the world that does that, more or less, is Israel, in addition to the United States. So in civilian terms, when it comes to the civilian needs, there is no alternative, also because the member states don't develop alternatives, in a sense, because they already have this. When it comes to security and defense, which is your focus, I guess, as well, with your question, well, as it stands now, Norway will need an agreement that also covers the security aspects of the space program. So we will need a bilateral agreement. So that is like, if we want anything at all, we need that agreement to begin with, which then also might then hopefully allow us to take part in, for example, the area square capacities, etc. And then this is something that is in the making in the EU, this kind of dual use thing. Nothing is purely military in the EU because the EU budget doesn't allow for pure military purposes, but the dual use. Many member states also do a lot, of course, in this domain, but I don't think it's an either or. I think we can do both, but we have to keep in mind that everything that France and Germany or the Netherlands do when it comes to space capabilities that are dual use are linked to the EU. And we tend not to, and to make an example, just to take another, we often discuss these bilateral agreements and the bilateral strategic partnerships. And we've seen all of these bilateral agreements in Europe developing also between the UK, France, UK, Germany, for example. But what happens in both of these kind of new bilateral big strategic partnerships is that everything that Germany does or France does when they sign agreements with the UK is strongly coordinated with all the EU member states and with the European Commission. And that is open. They say that in the open, so that because it has to kind of fit with the EU's policies and it has to fit with the EU's legal structures. So there's never going to be an independent France-UK corporation or an independent German-UK corporation. So I don't think it's an either or. We find in our evaluation that Norway can't really do without the EU space program and in civilian. And then, of course, it's the last point that is very debatable. The strategic choice of how much do we cooperate with Europe in a situation where the United States is becoming less, or not, if you don't want to use the word reliable, less engaged.
Just to add to an answer to your question and to what Marianne is saying, I mean, what France, Germany, Italy, even the Netherlands are doing are they're reconceptualizing their space program into their defense, national defense strategies. So they're calling it a space force, on a contrary to alternatives. And I think a more interesting question you could ask perhaps is what Norway should do with its relationship to commercial actors in the US when it comes to security, because we are so highly dependent on the civilian program that we are part of in the EU.
Right. We have one in the corner, and then after that, on the other corner.
Yes, hello, my name is Bjørn Elseth. I'm an independent advisor for space. Used to work at the Space Agency. I'd just like to follow up a little bit what Richard was telling about. I do think it's important that we have national capabilities. We launched our first satellite in Norway. That was not EU. That was national capacity doing ship surveillance. And now we have more satellites in that domain. Also this act about spaceport from Andøya, responsive space, all these things, and also the Arctic. I think that is also a common area where we can actually work together. So that was the third element I'd like to mention. So I think this combination about national capacities, EU, which is a technical agency, but we must remember that much of the capacity in the ESA is in the countries. It's in DLR, it's in France, it's in the Netherlands, and it's also here in the Nordic.
And then
Hi, yeah, thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the talk afterwards. Vincent Sevenga, I'm at the Department of Philosophy here at the University of Oslo. My background is an international space lawyer, so maybe not surprising my question will go back to the Artemis, of course. I kind of want to tag on to Katarina's question and also what Claudia kind of said. You say like it might bring people to the table and to have this diplomacy and maybe prompt sort of multilateralism. But on the one hand, there's already a choice to do it through the Artemis Accords and not through COPUS, which is the multilateral forum. So it's already sort of a retreat from this. And second, how much does it already frame, like how Claudia was saying, like, you know, you have this imagination of what can be and what is. How much does something like the Artemis Accords already frame what will be at least the fundamental rules there? It's not really an open discussion then anymore. It's more like a discussion under American ideas of what it should be, rather than a open discussion of what should outer space be for Earth, for the international community. I'm wondering your perspective on that. Thank you.
yes, we have a couple of big questions there, and we have 1 minute each before we have to end. So I'll let you give an answer to the questions, all of you, and also to follow up on perspectives that you would like to just give your closing notes. So we'll start with you, Mai'a, then Marianne, and then Claudia.
Yeah, thank you for the last couple of questions emphasizing Germany and national space capacity. I mean, for sure, there are national space programs, right? And capacity comes from within countries and EU member states, European countries as well. But it's then what is done with that capacity and how is it layered? And one thing I like to refer to is the annual meeting of the International Astronautical Congress, which has been in place expressing kind of the space flight idea for many, many decades. But it gathers around 10,000 people a year, including the national space agencies, including the multilateral space agencies and the countries, individual countries. And what strikes me every time that I attend this is that every single representative from all of these national countries with national capacity, all they emphasize is the need to work together with partners, that they need to cooperate, that all of this is too hard, too expensive to do alone, and that the way they make progress is by working together. So you need that underpinning what then occurs. But I think this is why we then focus on ESA and USPA and NASA and all its cooperative programs, because when it plays out, that's usually what happens. In security terms, it's a little more specific than that in terms of the groupings that you have and the desire to have strategic autonomy. There's those two dimensions going on. But in terms of the main lion's share of what I would argue is space is the scientific and technological side, which is fundamentally cooperative. And then in terms of the philosophy question on the Artemis Accords, the Artemis Accords not only, and again, I'm not the biggest fan of how it has played out with U.S. dominance, but the Artemis Accords not only originated from true multilateral kind of discussions to lay things out, it is fundamentally grounded in the Outer Space Treaty. So as Katarina said earlier, yeah, but that also was a time when there were different power dimensions. But if you look at the text of the Outer Space Treaty, it is very much about for the betterment of all humankind. Those kinds of phrases that we hear about from astronauts and so forth, they're virtually taken from the Outer Space Treaty. It's about the good of all of humanity. And because of that and other initiatives, when the astronauts first landed on the moon, they really said we are here from planet Earth. So that spirit, I think, is alive, and then it's transmitted through into the Artemis Accords, which reflect the Outer Space Treaty. But it isn't the end, right? It is, like you said, it is framing, but it is intended as the first step to basically say, when you sign on to the Artemis Accords, as Norway did, you more or less agree with the principles, but it's with the understanding that then there will be long discussions and very careful, specific discussions on the particular rules of the road going forward. So it is meant to be an opening starting point rather than the end of the discussion.
All right, Marianne and Claudia, if you could be short, that would be great, because we're moving towards the end. So, yeah.
Yes.
Please.
And actually in the EU too, there were lots of discussions on whether or not to join the Artemis Accords, precisely for that reason, right? Do we want to have like a global system, or do we want to have these clubs or groups of countries competing? And especially if we have Russia and China organizing on the other side of the table, so to speak, and also maybe integrating countries in their perspective or view on how we should regulate outer space. But but I guess, as Mai'a says, it's what we have at the moment, and it's moving really, really fast. So unless we have something to limit countries' behavior, it might. I'm so sorry. To limit countries' behavior, it might be even more competitive and dysfunctional systems, right? And again, distinguishing between outer space exploration and also what goes on in lower Earth orbit, where we have cooperation, I think is also important. When it comes to Norway and the EU, yeah, and well, a lot of what is going on in the EU, as you say, is based on national capabilities. The EU owns and manages Galileo, Copernicus, Iris Square, also the new things that they will launch to do the drone defense, air defense, etc. But it comes together with a lot of national capabilities, and that, I think, that's what's going on in Europe. You have this combination of EU things, NATO things, national things, and it's about what will the structure look like and how will it be coordinated. I think we tend to, in Norway, kind of neglect the key role that the EU is playing in coordinating all of this, because it has the regulatory tools, it has the institutional capacity, and it has budgetary powers, right? There is no other organization who can really go on and buy from private companies, but actually own big satellite systems in the future to the same extent, in a cooperative manner, like NATO couldn't do that, of course, but it's linked, but it's more closely coordinated with the member states than we tend to acknowledge in Norway. Norway has a great selling point in Andøya, Svalbard, and the High North. I think that if we get to join the EU space programs and then hopefully be able to join as much as we want within that, it will be because we have these things that are very valuable to the European Union.
Thank you, Marianne. So, Claudia, you have to be even briefer than Marianne, because it's already past 10:30. So, but please.
Okay, just 2 sentences on the second question on the Artemis Accord. So just, I share Mai'a and to a certain degree Marianne's optimism for institutional agreements and cooperation, but I think we should have a cautious approach to these, also thinking about which actors are setting the agenda and who falls between the cracks, what falls between the cracks, space exploration and exploitation for whom. Continue asking these questions, because as we see, ownership equals control also.
Okay, so this has been the first seminar in the research project that I mentioned in the beginning, Discover, building bridges, Earth to orbit, building bridges in space governance, and there will be more. The research project will go on for until the end of 2028. So stay put, pay attention to what we're doing. And please give a big applause to the panelists for sharing their knowledge and expertise to us today.